Hello, everybody, and welcome to Sake Revolution. This is America's first sake podcast, and I have the honor of being one of your hosts. My name is John Puma. You may know me from the Sake Notes. I'm also the administrator over the internet, Sake Discord, as well as Reddit's r/sake community.
And I'm your host, Timothy Sullivan. I'm a sake samurai and a sake educator, as well as the founder of the Urban Sake website. And every week, John and I will be here tasting and chatting about all things sake, doing our best to make it fun and easy to understand. And
I'm hoping that today's episode will be extra fun. I think with what we have in store. Then Tim, I don't know if you've been checking things out lately, but the news is not always good. It's frequently bad, yes. Actually. Yeah. But Tim, you went out and found us some very interesting sake news. And we've done this once before when it was bubbling up. There was a lot of sake news. And so we did one of these episodes where we talked about sake in the news. And the time has come again. You went out and you found some very interesting articles from all over the world about sake in the English language. And remind you, there are doubtlessly plenty of other articles on sake and in other languages, probably Japanese being first and foremost, but we're restricting this one to English language articles. And you found quite a few, and I'm hoping because the real news is bad usually. Is this good news, Tim?
I can't promise only good news, John.
Oh no!
But we do these Sake in the News episodes a few times a year. We've done it once before, so this is our second Sake in the News, and there's been some substantial news, so I think we should get into it.
All right.
Yeah.
I like that.
Well, the sake elephant in the room is the New York Times. So
yes.
This is from February 27th, 2023. We'll have a link in our show notes. There is an article in the New York Times, a big article about sake. Sake is booming in America. Now, you saw this article, I'm sure you, John.
I did. And this fits in the good news category for sure, because we're all, I think, very excited about the growth of sake in America. We do have a sake podcast, so it's probably a good thing for us that sake is growing in America. I do hope that we're doing things to help sake grow in America. But yeah, let's talk a little bit about that article.
The article was written by Eric Asimov, who's normally one of the wine writers for the New York Times. And my understanding from hearing some background sources is that he reached out to a few people to write a small article about sake and then kind of discovered that there's a lot more going on than he thought. And the scope of the article expanded. And I think that he tried to cover a lot in the article. He talked about import sales. He talked about domestic production. And there was just a lot going on in the article. But I think it just points to the fact that it's a big, complex industry and that there's a lot happening.
They covered Brooklyn Kura and their expanding relationship with Hakaisan. They talked about Dasai's opening of their brewery in Hyde Park. And then a lot of information about Origami, the sake brewery that is currently being built over in Hot Springs, Arkansas, with a friend of the show, Ben Bell. Over there is a big part of it. And that's a 24,000 square foot brewery. We're gonna revisit that in a big way one day, I'm sure, Tim.
Yeah.
But it was really nice to see, the mainstream newspaper have this really substantial article about the beverage we all know and love.
And I know it is a mainstream article when I have friends of mine who have nothing to do with sake message me out of the blue and say, hey, I know you're connected to sake somehow. And did you see that it was in the New York Times? I'm sure you saw it, but here's the link. So when people on other sides of your life are sending you the link, you know that it's reaching a wide audience for sure.
Yeah, I had people in my office do the same thing because I do work in a finance firm, and some people in the hallway were like, hey, did you see that article? And I was like, yes, I did. It was really nice. Anything that raises the sake profile, I think, is really great to see.
Yeah. So the thrust of the article, as we said, really was two-pronged. And let's talk about the first one, which is that sake sales are booming around the United States.
Yeah.
Yeah. So from 2012 to 2022, exports from Japan more than doubled.
I can
That's
easily
amazing.
believe that.
Yeah.
I just, from you and I, like our observations, we talk sometimes about how, like, when we were first getting into sake, how limited the selections were and how hard it was to find certain things. And between then and now, it's like there's so much more.
Yeah.
And that's got to be because people are buying. They're not doing that for the fun of it.
Well, John, I think you drank a good portion of that doubling that happened.
So what you're saying is that the main change is that I entered the chat.
Yes.
Is that
When Puma hit the scene,
and started
exports started
single-handedly increase. Does that mean that there's a significant dip every year when I go to Japan?
I don't know about that. No, I think when you go to Japan, you encourage brewers that don't export to get their act together and send more sake over here. So
I try.
You're doing
Try
the
my
Lord's
best.
work.
Yeah, this I think this was a really feel good. And they, as you mentioned, they did start out with talking about just like how the exports are growing. And that's really great.
Yeah. And the article opens with information about Kato Sake Works, who's also a friend of the show. He's also featured in the article, and he's expanding his brewery in Bushwick. Mm-hmm. And that's another really exciting kind of indication of where the sake industry's headed right now. So exciting. Okay.
Yeah, it's great.
Okay, John. So we've talked about our first big sake in the news, New York Times. If you haven't read it yet, we'll have a link to it in the show notes. Be sure to check it out. John, before we go on to our next two articles, should we get some sake going here?
That's a great idea. We are going to do our part to increase sake sales and imports by drinking some sake.
All right. What do we have to drink for today?
So today is a local variation of something I like to do in Japan when I go, and that's having sake from familiar brands, but bottles that I'm not that familiar with. Mm-hmm. That gets to be a lot of fun. In this case, we have the Churyo Omachi Junmai Ginjo. Now, if the Churyo sounds familiar to you,
it does ring a bell. It does ring a bell.
It is because we talked about and drank their sake on episode 86. Now, they are known primarily for their taru sake. They are specialists in taru sake. They have a lot of feelings. They have a lot of thoughts on taru sake. And go back to 86. We talk about it at length. But they're not just taru, Tim. They also make a couple of other sakes, including this one. Again, this one is the Omachi Junmai Ginjo. Churyo Shuzo is located in Nara Prefecture. And Tim, you're going to love this. Their motto on their website is it's two sentences: no limit to sake brewing and no extremes in sake brewing.
No extremes.
No extremes. So I'm guessing they're probably not going to be to my Shell's taste.
Well, we have to guess this is not crazy style then.
Definitely not. Definitely not crazy style. They probably won't be featured on an episode of Extreme Sake. But I like a nice, easy sipping sake too.
I don't know. I don't know about that motto, because if you say no limits, that usually means you're willing to go pretty extreme. But then they say no extremes. I'm getting mixed signals.
Yeah, Tim, I didn't ask. I just saw it. I'm just reporting what was
You're
on
just
the site.
reporting.
Speaking of the news, I'm just reporting the news. But anyway, back to the sake at hand. It's omachi rice from Takashima in Okayama Prefecture. It's milled down to 58% of its original size. That's a oddly specific number, in my opinion. The sake meter value is 3.5. Acidity is 1.5. And the alcohol percentage is a nice and reasonable 15. So it'll be something that we can sip on while we talk about the rest of the news, and we probably won't get too drunk.
Right. And this is good to know that they make sake in Nara Prefecture, but they're using omachi from Okayama Prefecture, which is the home of omachi. So that's a really good, interesting detail here. So should we get it in the glass?
I think we should.
All right.
So one thing that's really interesting about this, like right when you take a look at the bottle, is that the label is a really thicker sticker than the usual sake label. And it has some texture to it and an almost like reflective quality. It's a little eye-catching when you see it on the shelf. I did a little research, and it looks like this is not the same label they use for the sake in Japan, based on what's on their site, at least. It's very eye-catching, very unique and different.
It's not unusual for breweries to pick out a different label for their U.S. exports versus domestic.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's give it a smell here.
Yeah. It has a lot of that richness and that nuttiness that I associate with omachi in a lot of ways. And
yeah,
and there is a ricey note as well, like just your steamed rice note.
It's got some earthiness to me. Like, often we talk about omachi being the more rustic, kind of earthy, down to earth sake rice. And this kind of encapsulates that for me. The aroma here is earthy and a little robust.
Yeah.
All right.
Earthy is definitely a word that comes to mind here. I'm getting a lot of that here.
Yeah, some umami too. There's some savoriness. If you think about just like a little hint of a soy sauce flavor going on, some riciness.
It's interesting. Like stylistically, I feel like this drinks more like what you call junmai, rather than like what we usually think of with junmai ginjo. I know that at the end of the day, it's just a rice milling and blah, blah, blah. But I think there's a stylistic component to what a brewery decides sometimes. And so this definitely fits a little bit more with that. What I think of when I think of like a nice, rich junmai with a lot of like riciness to it. Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely has some savoriness, I think is the word I want to use here. It's savory sake.
I like that.
Yeah. And
I like that.
I might think that this sake could be good warmed up as well. What do you think about that?
I completely agree. This is definitely something that as I sip on it, I'm like, room temperature, maybe a little bit warm.
Yep.
Might be like the bullseye spot for this. We always default to chilled here when we start, unless something very unusual is happening.
Yeah.
But, we learn and we we taste things and we learn about them. And I do think that maybe room temp or something like that would open this up in interesting ways.
For sure. Well, we can let it sit and chillax. We have two more articles to talk about.
Excellent.
So, John, the next sake article you actually found, do you want to give us the deets on that one?
Yeah. So I'm going to put this one under bad news.
Oh, bad news. Okay.
I think this one's bad news.
Okay.
This article is from Nikkei in Japan, but it was published in English, is that supersized sake bottles are becoming a thing of the past in Japan. This was published on March the 6th, 2023.
Ooh. So we all know those bottles, right? The 1.8 liters. I call them the party size or the magnum size.
The party size. I love it. Yeah, the Issho-bin, the party size 1.8 liter magnum of sake. And apparently the sales are falling. Yes. And the shipments of the 1.8 liter bottles have declined by, and this blew my mind when I saw this number, 80%.
Oh my God.
Since 2002. So I didn't know what sake was in 2002. So it's quite a long time. But, I think that what we're seeing here with this is COVID didn't help. Generally speaking, those big bottles go to restaurants in Japan. Yeah. So whenever you go to an izakaya, 9 out of 10 times, the bottles that are in the fridge at the sake bar or the izakaya are those big bottles because they go through them. Yeah. Sake doesn't keep forever, so they go through them rather rapidly, and it works. And it's worked for a really long time. But during COVID, those restaurants were closed most of the time. Over in Japan, there was a government-mandated closure that lasted a lot longer than a lot of other countries, and that made demand for the 1.8s drop. The analysts do feel that it's expected to pick up for fiscal 2020. This was the Nikkei, so this is a financial news article. But they're expecting the fiscal 2022 year to have an uptick in the sales of the Issho-bin. But long term, they're still expecting it to go down.
Well, from our point of view, 1.8 liter bottles have never really been a huge player in the U.S. market, right?
No, they're not. we know a handful of places around here that really use them.
Mm-hmm.
Most places are using the smaller 720 milliliter bottles.
Yeah, as we've talked about in the past, we did an episode on different bottle sizes in the past. And in Japan, as you mentioned, very often you're going to see these large 1.8 liter bottles because they sell sake by the 180 milliliter serving. And it makes financial sense for restaurants to serve out of the larger. It's basically like selling everything by the carafe.
Yeah.
And if you buy a sake fridge in Japan as a restaurant, like a restaurant equipment fridge, the bottles fit in there perfectly. But those bottles do not fit in my American fridge.
No. There was a period where I reconfigured my fridge so that I can put them in, but you still can only fit like 3 in a converted wine chiller. It is what it is. But I think like the purpose of these bottles were for sake bars and for izakayas, and as long as they are really healthy, they'll probably continue to sell. But when they're not healthy, as has been the case for 2 years, that you're gonna see a bad situation come up.
For me, one interesting thing is that I think this mirrors a trend that's been happening, which is the growth of the premium sake market and the diminishing of the table sake market, the futsushi market. So as more and more consumers turn to premium and ultra premium sakes, those are more often bottled in 720 ml and smaller, like wine-sized bottles.
Right.
And the more entry-level table sakes, everyday sakes are bottled usually in the larger size. And as the consumers switch more to high-end, wine-like, super premium sakes, I think that is also going to reinforce this trend. What do you think?
Well, I think that's right. But I also think that if you look back at our previous news story, sake booming in the West. And as you pointed out, in the West, they're not buying Issho-bin really.
Yeah.
We're buying 720 milliliter bottles. We're buying 1 cup sometimes, or 300 milliliter bottles, but we're not buying really large ones. They're not what sells here. And so if the foreign market is going to become a bigger portion of the pot, it leaves less room for those other big bottles that are just going to be used domestically for the most part.
Yeah. But I will give you my point of view on one reason why I don't think 1.8 liter bottles are going to go away.
Okay.
It's because a lot of breweries in Japan have invested in the machinery to bottle this bottle size.
That's an excellent point.
I don't think that they're just on a trend. I don't think they're going to chuck that equipment in the garbage. And I think that even if it doesn't make it over here as often, 1.8 liter bottles will continue at a smaller scale to be a presence in Japan for sure.
Yeah. I think, you're absolutely right about the fact that the machinery is already there. And also in Japan, they do a really good job of recycling those bottles. The izakayas put out the empties every night. They come by and, they are picked up every morning. Their glass recycling there is quite advanced compared to what we have going over here, I want to say.
Yeah, and it's very ecologically friendly to keep recycling and reusing these bottles. And I've seen it as well. The recycling program is like next level in Japan when it comes to these bottles. It's great.
Yeah.
Do you like the 1.8 liter bottles personally? When you have them at home, is it fun for you or is it an annoyance?
Honestly, I haven't bought one in years. It's also, there's not that many places in New York that sell them. I know a couple places that do, but I just haven't bought them in the longest time. And also, don't ask either of us, but can the average person finish that in an appropriate amount of time? Again, don't ask us.
Yes.
But you bring it to a party. Hey, that's nice. Everybody wins.
Yep.
For just having stuff at home, it's hard.
So for you personally at home, you think it's a little inconvenient, not offered that many places, doesn't fit in the fridge.
Right.
Hard to finish. If
I had a bigger fridge, maybe I'd change my mind. Maybe the rest of those things would not be factors.
Well, for everyone's reference, the 1.8 liter bottles we're talking about is equal to 2.5 of the standard bottle size, the 720 ml. So it's like having 2.5 bottles in one.
If you find a place that sells them and you compare the pricing with the 720 milliliter bottles, it's a steal.
It's a good deal.
It's a really good deal. If you have a sake that you absolutely love and you see the Issho-bin of it, if you have the space for it, you buy that. It's great. It's a really cost-effective way to get a lot of sake.
Yes, I've done that for parties. I think I might have done that for my wedding reception too, that, you know, you order the 1.8 liters and it's just more fun per ounce or whatever.
More fun per ounce. Oh, that's going to be a headline for our next show. Sake Revolution, more fun per ounce than your average podcast. It's been a few minutes now, Tim. I want to revisit our sake.
Oh, yeah, that's a good idea. All right.
So I kept a very small amount in my glass so that it would warm up a little bit faster. And I've been kind of treating it with my hands a little bit, kind of putting them on the outside of the bowl of the wine glass just to help it along. I want to see what happens when it's a little warmer.
All right.
Aroma wise, I'm still getting that riciness is actually more forward, I want to say.
Yeah, it's still the same sake. It's still savory to me.
Yeah, it's still. I mean, I don't expect it to get fruity, Tim, but I'm enjoying it more for certain. I think that having it as chilled as I did might have been trying to stick a round peg into a square hole, and it's much more comfortable at this temperature. It comes off a little bit smoother, I want to say.
Yeah, it's definitely opened up, as they say.
Yes, they do say that, don't they? Oh boy! So I think we do have one more article that we're going to talk about, and Tim, you're gonna lead us in this one. Is this good news or bad news?
This is good news.
Ah, yes.
Yes. So this is an article from that was published on the BBC, and this is right on the heels of the New York Times article. So this was published on March 1st, 2023. And the headline here is that sake brewers toast big rise in global sales.
So what I'm getting out of that title is it's not just America.
It's not just America. Right.
Excellent.
I think that this is a supplemental article, a little bit smaller in scale to what the New York Times was saying, which is that the exports have really increased over the last 10 years. And this is all with the backdrop of domestic sales of sake in Japan declining. Yeah. Right. So,
and that's been the story for years.
Yes, for years.
Domestic sales are dropping, so they need to look to the West, and off we go.
Yeah. So the article highlights that of the 1,100 breweries or so in Japan, the ones that do exports have seen a bright spot in that there have been increases for 12 years in a row. So the increase in export sales have been ongoing, continual upward trend. We mentioned that sake sales have been going down, but in Japan, all alcohol has been going down. This isn't just, I think younger people, Generation Z, Triple Z, whatever it's called.
Z, is that hard Z? I don't know. We actually talked about this in our previous Sake in the News episode. There was an article that you had picked out that talked about how the younger generation weren't drinking sake, and they were looking for people to come up with ways to make them drink alcohol. And that was the thrust of that.
Yeah. Another really interesting point, and you and I have talked about this a lot, is that brewers are looking at wine-like sake profiles to try and raise interest.
We know that's the truth.
We know that story.
Is this story that a son or daughter of the Kuramoto ventures out into the world and comes back and takes over and then makes sake that is a little bit wine-like?
Yeah. The article mentions not the prodigal son storyline, but the fact that they enter sakes into wine tasting competitions and are making more wine-like, high-acid, long-finish sakes.
Yeah, there are plenty of them out there. That's definitely a trend.
It's a big trend, and I don't see it as the silver bullet answer to growing the sake industry, but it sure doesn't hurt. It's a great supplement, don't you think?
Yeah. I think it's a good thing to have them there. And I do think that they're more approachable to people who are into wine. I think that, what do they say here? Also in the article, lighter, fruitier sakes are more accessible to people used to wine. All right. I like lighter, fruitier sakes, so this is perfect for me. And that's great for me. Oh, and high-end sake sales were helped by the coronavirus pandemic, with consumers exploring new products and categories while being stuck at home. And I think that is a fact. That is something that, like, there were so many people that even I know, like, anecdotally, that knew a little bit about sake or maybe tasted sake before and got really into it during the pandemic because a lot of the delivery services really kind of like blew up and people were able to experiment at home and try things. And also, let's not forget that for people who were getting even more into sake, for the first time ever, a lot of the breweries were accessible over the internet for people. There were so many different sake tastings, so many brewery tours. So people who were, kind of sake curious and starting to dip their foot in had a great situation where they can really get access that people like you and me, when we were first getting into it, we didn't have that.
Right.
And that's great. So I'm really, it warms my heart to see that sake is rising globally.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to look at it a little bit from a historical perspective as well, because history's happening all the time. We're right in the middle of a transition.
Oh, yeah.
And when people look back in 50 years to what's happening now in the sake industry, I think this is really, we're right in the middle of this wave of transition from sake being a domestic Japanese product that has a certain quality to a super premium worldwide beverage. And
world beverage, yes. Yes.
That's the goal for so many brewers. And I know with so many brewers have their eye on that goal, that we will get there more and more. But articles like this are just, I feel this is like the crest of the wave happening. And, over the next couple decades, we're going to see the fruition of what happens with all these efforts to make sake more globally approachable.
Yeah. Do you see a world where one day, like, American sake is just like a regional type? I think that when we have sake here that's brewed in America, we always have this thing about like, it's not quite as good as the stuff in Japan. Is it quite as like, maybe one day it'll just be different. It'll just be, it'll just be like equally respected, but different vibe.
Yeah. I mean, history repeats itself. And in the wine world, they had the Judgment in Paris, which we've talked about, where they did a blind tasting of French wines and American wines, and the French wine judges picked the Napa Valley wines as the best, and the world freaked out, and it was never the same. And I'm not saying we need blind tasting to tell us that, but I think that in the future, as more and more sake rice is grown outside of Japan, which for me is a key development in the quality standard going up for U.S. sake, we're going to see that there's going to be really good sake made all around the world. The faster that happens, the sooner it's going to be a global beverage. So we want to do everything we can to support breweries all over the world. And there's just the very beginnings of that happening in Europe and Mexico and all around the world.
Yeah.
And right now we can count everything on a couple hands, but soon it will be.
We'll get there.
We'll get there. Yeah.
Yeah. To follow up on your point about the wine challenge thing, is that there's also, Japan had their moment of that for whiskey.
Yes.
Good point. Where Suntory won a whiskey tasting in Scotland. Yes. And after that happened, there was this mad rush on Japanese whiskey that has not ended yet.
Yes. That's a good point, that it hasn't stopped. Like Japanese whiskey arrived, and it wasn't like, oh, this is a trend, it's going. No, people still want whatever they can get their hands on. And
Japan is recognized, just like Scotland is, as a place with exceptional whiskey. And it's always going to be like that now. Yeah. That's great.
I think it's only a matter of time.
It'll be one of those tipping point moments too, where there's some kind of a thing and something from America really shows up great, and then that'll become big. And you'll see people in Japan will start trying to get that sake from America.
That is so great. Like the the boomerang effect of sake becoming so good and so appreciated overseas, it mirrors back to Japan, and the Japanese people are like, oh, this is, our thing. And they're going to rediscover even more appreciation for sake when it gains such appreciation overseas. What do you think?
I like that idea.
Yeah.
The resurgence of sake in Japan will come from sake becoming a big deal in America. I like that. That sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah.
It could happen.
Yeah, as more and more people really discover sake overseas, the Japanese are going to say, hey, this is ours and this is cool. And get back into it in a more deeper way.
Yes.
All right, John. Well, we hit 3 big news articles.
Mm-hmm.
I think despite the reduction in use of the 1.8 liter bottles, I'm going to call this a win.
I think so too. I think that, even though the vessel may be shrinking, the sake is increasing.
Yes.
At least in the West and everywhere else in the world, according to BBC, which is great. I'm really excited. This is great stuff to hear.
Yeah. For the foreseeable future, there should be no shortage in high acid wine-like sakes to keep us talking.
Yeah. And there's, and in the West, there'll be a whole bunch of selections. We got a lot of breweries opening up. It's going to be a hell of a ride, I think.
Yes. Watch this space.
Yes.
All right. Well, great to taste with you, John. And I want to thank all of our listeners for tuning in again this week. A special hello and thank you to all our patrons. If you enjoy Sake Revolution and you want to support us, you can visit patreon.com/Sake Revolution and consider becoming a patron.
And while you're considering that, go ahead and drop us a review over on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Chartable. Anywhere, really. Wherever you get your podcast, that's the place we want to see your reviews. It really gets the word out about our show, helps the algorithm find us so that when people are looking for sake stuff, we're the sake stuff they find.
And be sure to check out sakerevolution.com for our show notes. We have a full transcript each and every week, all the details on the news articles and the sake we tasted today.
And I can think of nothing else better to do right now after all this good news than to raise my glass, like you should be doing at home. Remember to keep drinking sake and
Kanpai.